For decades, the deepest secrets of the British monarchy were believed to be locked safely behind Royal Archives documents sealed under strict orders, protected by tradition and guarded by silence. But one quiet review inside the Royal Archive triggered something nobody expected. A document surfaced. Not just any document, but a final amendment written in the unmistakable hand of Prince Philip himself. An amendment that rewrote the royal balance of power overnight. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began like countless other archival reviews carried out within the rigidly controlled corridors of royal record-keeping. Archivists had opened sealed estate files connected to Prince Philip's private papers, expecting little more than routine verification dates, signatures, historical cross-references. These were documents that had sat untouched for years, cataloged carefully, and filed under instructions that had never been questioned. Yet buried between standard legal documents and property summaries, something unusual appeared. A single amendment, thin but unmistakably deliberate, attached to Philip's estate records. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A final revision, perhaps. A clerical note. But when archivists read the contents more closely, the calm routine of the archive room collapsed into stunned silence. The amendment carried a date that startled everyone who examined it. It had been written late in Prince Philip's life, at a time when royal estate planning was believed to have already been finalized years earlier. Every major asset, every trust, every personal holding had long been assumed to follow established expectations. That was the quiet understanding within palace circles. But the amendment shattered that assumption instantly. The directive inside the document was unmistakable and breathtaking in its scope. Philip had reassigned control of his private legacy, his holdings, confidential trusts, influence networks, and institutional partnerships to a single individual. It was not the future king. It was not the heir to the throne. The name written clearly in Philip's own hand was Prince Edward. For a moment, the archivists assumed a mistake had occurred. Royal estates were complex structures, and clerical revisions were not unheard of. Perhaps a name had been misfiled. Perhaps the document had been placed incorrectly among Philip's records. Yet the more closely the amendment was examined, the more impossible those explanations became. The handwriting matched Prince Philip's personal style exactly. Independent experts confirmed it. The phrasing matched Philip's known legal instructions. The seal attached to the document carried the correct authentication marks. This was no error. This was Prince Philip's final directive. Once the authenticity became undeniable, the archivists followed protocol. Senior palace officials were notified immediately. Legal advisors were summoned. Estate managers were quietly briefed. Within hours, a meeting was convened behind closed palace doors where the implications of the amendment were read aloud in careful, measured tones. The effect was immediate and profound. Philip had not merely redistributed financial assets. He had reassigned the stewardship of a vast and intricate private legacy networks built across decades of royal diplomacy, charitable influence, and institutional partnerships that stretched far beyond the public eye. Inside the palace, whispers began spreading quickly among those trusted enough to be informed. The amendment did not interfere with the royal line of succession. That remained untouched. But the influence attached to Philip's personal legacy was immense. Control over those networks meant control over philanthropic initiatives, global partnerships, confidential trusts, and decades of carefully cultivated relationships. In other words, Philip had transferred the guardianship of something far greater than wealth. He had transferred power. For generations, assumptions about Philip's legacy had quietly pointed toward the senior figures of the royal family. It seemed almost inevitable that such influence would eventually align with the monarchy's future kings. Yet Philip had bypassed those expectations entirely. Instead, the responsibility had been placed upon the shoulders of the monarchy's youngest son, the prince, who had spent much of his life outside the fiercest royal spotlight. As palace officials tried to absorb the magnitude of what the amendment meant, a single question began to circulate with growing urgency. Why had Prince Philip chosen Edward? Why now, at the very end of his life, had he rewritten the structure of his legacy so dramatically? And as stunned palace advisors scrambled to understand why Philip made such a dramatic final decision, the deeper story begins to unfold because Prince Philip's relationship with his youngest son had always been far more complicated than the public ever realized. To the public, Prince Edward had always been the quiet royal, the youngest son, who rarely commanded headlines and seldom stood at the center of royal drama. Yet behind palace walls, Prince Philip had watched Edward more closely than anyone realized. While the world focused on the future kings, Philip had been studying something else entirely: loyalty, resilience, and the one son who never chased the crown. For much of his life, Edward occupied a position that seemed almost invisible within the towering structure of the royal family. As the youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, he grew up in the long shadow cast by older siblings whose lives were constantly under scrutiny. Charles carried the weight of the future crown. Anne had already earned a reputation for fierce dedication and independence. Andrew's role within the royal spotlight was firmly established. Edward, by contrast, often appeared to drift quietly at the edge of royal expectation. Public attention rarely lingered on him for long, and for years he seemed destined to remain the least discussed member of the royal siblings. Yet within the palace, Prince Philip was observing something very different. Edward's early life did not follow the rigid script traditionally written for royal sons. Instead of immediately immersing himself in royal duties, he explored paths that raised eyebrows among royal advisors. His decision to venture into media production and television projects created murmurs within palace circles, and at first, Philip reportedly viewed those choices with sharp skepticism. The Duke of Edinburgh had spent his entire life defined by discipline, duty, and unwavering commitment to the crown. Watching his youngest son experiment outside those boundaries did not immediately inspire confidence. For a time, that tension quietly lingered between father and son. Those close to the family would later recall that Philip had expected Edward to demonstrate the same hardened sense of royal obligation that had defined previous generations. Instead, Edward appeared to be searching for his own identity, an identity not entirely bound by palace expectations. But something remarkable began to happen over the years that followed. As Edward gradually stepped back into the framework of royal responsibility, Philip began noticing qualities that had been hidden beneath the earlier uncertainty. Edward did not seek attention. He did not compete for prominence. He did not chase influence or attempt to position himself within royal power struggles. Instead, he showed patience, quiet endurance, a willingness to work within the institution rather than reshape it around himself. Slowly, Philip's early frustration softened into something far more significant: respect. That shift became especially visible through one of Philip's most treasured lifelong achievements, the Duke of Edinburgh Award Program. The initiative had grown into a global force for youth development, shaping the lives of millions across continents. To Philip, the program represented more than charity. It represented legacy. And over time, Edward began taking on increasing responsibility within the organization, not out of obligation, but out of genuine commitment. Father and son began sharing long discussions about the program's future, its mission, and the enormous responsibility of preserving what Philip had built over decades. Within palace corridors, observers began noticing the subtle but unmistakable change in their relationship. Edward was no longer the uncertain youngest son navigating his place within the monarchy. He was becoming someone Philip trusted deeply, someone who listened carefully, worked quietly, and carried out responsibilities without seeking recognition. The conversations between them grew longer, more personal, at times even strategic. Philip began relying on Edward not only for charitable initiatives, but also for private logistical discussions involving long-term royal projects. To outsiders, nothing dramatic seemed to be happening. Edward remained understated, measured, almost deliberately out of the spotlight. But beneath that calm surface, a foundation of trust was quietly being constructed. A trust that went beyond fatherly affection. A trust rooted in something Philip valued above almost everything else: loyalty to the institution itself. And in hindsight, those who would later examine Philip's final amendment would begin to recognize something chillingly clear. The decision that shocked palace archivists had not been made suddenly in the final chapter of Philip's life. It had been forming slowly, quietly, through years of observation, conversation, and growing confidence in the one son who never tried to claim the crown, but who may have understood its true burden better than anyone expected. But admiration alone could never explain such a dramatic decision, and when investigators began tracing the timeline of Philip's amendment, they discovered something even more unsettling. The change happened during one of the most turbulent moments in modern royal history. Royal decisions rarely happen in isolation. Behind every decree lies a moment, a turning point, when loyalty is tested and trust is broken. For Prince Philip, that moment came during a period of unprecedented tension within the royal family. While the world saw public unity, Philip was privately witnessing fractures that would shake his confidence in the monarchy's future. As the years advanced and Philip's time within the royal institution drew closer to its final chapter, the calm exterior of the monarchy began to mask a growing storm. The public image of unity remained carefully maintained, polished through ceremonies, speeches, and carefully crafted appearances. Yet behind those polished surfaces, pressures were building that even the palace's most seasoned advisors struggled to contain. Internal tensions had begun intensifying, and those closest to the family understood that the monarchy was entering one of its most delicate periods in decades. Philip, who had spent more than 70 years at the very center of royal life, understood the fragile balance that held the institution together. He had watched crises rise and fall before, but the atmosphere surrounding the royal family during his final years felt different. Public scrutiny had grown sharper. Family disputes had begun spilling into the open. Media attention seemed relentless, probing every disagreement and amplifying every controversy. To outsiders, these moments appeared as headlines and speculation, but to Philip, they represented something far more serious. They were signs of instability within a system that relied heavily on unity and quiet discipline. Those close to the palace would later suggest that these events weighed heavily on Philip's mind. The Duke of Edinburgh had always believed the monarchy survived not through popularity, but through endurance, structure, and loyalty to the institution itself. Yet as disputes unfolded within the family, Philip reportedly began questioning whether the delicate balance he had helped preserve for decades could withstand the pressure of modern scrutiny. Trust, something he valued deeply, was becoming harder to measure. It was during this period that Philip quietly began reviewing his private affairs. Not the ceremonial duties the public recognized, but the deeply personal structures he had built over decades. His private trusts, institutional partnerships, and long-term initiatives connected to his vision for the monarchy's future. Those networks represented years of influence, careful diplomacy, and relationships cultivated beyond public view. They were part of a legacy Philip wanted protected long after he was gone. Legal advisors were summoned more frequently than usual. Their visits were discreet, carefully scheduled, and rarely discussed outside a small circle of trusted palace staff. Conversations stretched for hours as estate plans that had once seemed final were suddenly reopened. Documents were reviewed, language adjusted, clauses reconsidered. The work was methodical but unmistakably deliberate. Philip was rethinking something fundamental. Within the notes attached to those consultations, one name began appearing again and again: Edward. At first it was subtle. References to responsibilities. Mentions of stewardship over certain projects. Questions about long-term oversight of Philip's personal initiatives. But as the drafts evolved, Edward's role grew increasingly central. Legal advisors began recognizing the direction Philip's thinking was taking, though few could have predicted how far he intended to go. Then came the meeting that would later become the subject of quiet speculation inside the palace. A private conversation between Philip and Edward, held away from advisors, lasting nearly 3 hours. No official transcript exists. No detailed account was ever recorded. Yet those aware of the meeting understood that something important had happened inside that closed room. When Philip's legal team resumed their work afterward, the tone of the documents had shifted decisively. The amendment that would later shock royal archivists appeared shortly after that meeting. Whatever father and son discussed during those hours changed the course of Philip's final decision. It transformed earlier drafts into the sweeping directive that would eventually transfer the guardianship of Philip's entire private legacy to Edward. Yet the content of that conversation remains sealed behind the same silence that has long protected the monarchy's most sensitive moments. And as historians and archivists continued examining Philip's records, a realization slowly began to emerge. The amendment was never simply about distributing wealth or assets among family members. Something deeper had driven Philip's decision, something tied to his fears about the monarchy's future. Yet the deeper archivists looked into Philip's records, the more they realized this amendment wasn't simply about inheritance, it was about protecting something far bigger than wealth. To the public, Prince Philip's legacy was defined by duty and decades of royal service. But behind the ceremonial appearances existed another side of Philip's life, one built on private trusts, strategic relationships, and influence networks quietly developed over 70 years beside the throne. When archivists examined the amendment more closely, they realized Edward wasn't just inheriting assets, he was inheriting Philip's hidden royal infrastructure. The deeper investigators studied the amendment. The clearer one truth became, Prince Philip had spent a lifetime constructing an intricate system of influence that operated far beyond what the public ever saw. While the world recognized him as the steadfast consort standing beside Queen Elizabeth II, Philip had quietly built something far more complex behind the curtain of ceremony. These were not simply financial holdings or personal possessions. They were structures, carefully arranged trusts, confidential partnerships, philanthropic alliances, and institutional relationships that had taken decades to cultivate. Together, they formed a quiet network that extended across charities, global initiatives, research institutions, and diplomatic channels tied to Philip's personal mission. Many of these trusts existed entirely separate from official crown property. They were private, structured through discrete legal arrangements that allowed Philip to direct resources toward causes he believed in without the limitations imposed by formal royal administration. Over time, these networks had grown into powerful engines supporting youth development programs, environmental research initiatives, educational foundations, and international partnerships that operated across continents. Some were widely known through charitable work, while others remained far more discreet collaborations and research programs supported quietly without public fanfare. As archivists mapped the reach of these connections, the scale of Philip's private influence began to emerge with startling clarity. What appeared at first to be a simple amendment to estate records was actually something much more strategic. The document did not divide Philip's networks into pieces for multiple heirs. It consolidated them. Every trust, every private holding, every operational partnership connected to Philip's legacy was placed under a single steward. That steward was Prince Edward. Within the palace, the implications of that decision became impossible to ignore. Philip had chosen not to scatter his life's work among family members or allow competing priorities to dilute its impact. Instead, he had concentrated responsibility into one pair of hands. Legal advisors reviewing the amendment would later suggest that Philip feared fragmentation above all else. Dividing these networks between several heirs could weaken the influence he had built so carefully over decades. Competing directions, conflicting agendas, and shifting priorities might eventually dismantle the delicate system he had created. Philip wanted continuity, a single guardian. And when observers began examining why Edward had been chosen for that role, the reasoning became quietly compelling. Edward had spent much of his life operating without the turbulence that surrounded other members of the royal family. He maintained a reputation for restraint, discretion, and careful judgment qualities that were invaluable when managing sensitive relationships tied to royal influence. These were networks that required patience, diplomacy, and the ability to navigate delicate conversations behind closed doors. Philip appears to have believed that Edward possessed exactly that temperament. A steady hand, a quiet mind, someone capable of maintaining partnerships without drawing unnecessary attention to them. In many ways, Edward's reputation for staying out of the spotlight may have made him uniquely suited to oversee operations that depended on trust rather than publicity. The more historians studied the amendment, the more the picture sharpened. This was never simply a financial transfer. It was a strategic handover of an entire infrastructure built across 7 decades of royal service. Philip had essentially appointed Edward as the custodian of a vast private network designed to continue shaping charitable, institutional, and diplomatic efforts long after Philip himself was gone. And once that realization began spreading through palace corridors, the meaning of Philip's final amendment changed completely. It was no longer viewed as a personal family decision. It had become something far more significant, a calculated shift in how one of the monarchy's most influential legacies would be protected moving forward. But when news of the amendment quietly reached senior members of the royal family, the reaction inside the palace was far from calm. Royal families are built on tradition, but they are also built on expectations. And when those expectations collapse, the consequences can ripple through generations. When Philip's final amendment was revealed to senior royals, it reportedly triggered a wave of disbelief. Because for decades, many had quietly assumed Philip's legacy would flow toward the future kings. The revelation did not arrive with public announcements or ceremonial statements. Instead, it traveled quietly through the most guarded corridors of the palace, carried by legal briefings and carefully worded explanations delivered behind closed doors. Once archivists confirmed the authenticity of Philip's amendment, senior royal aides were instructed to inform the highest levels of the family immediately. Among the first to be briefed was King Charles, whose position as monarch placed him at the center of any discussion concerning royal legacy and influence. Those present during the initial explanation would later describe the atmosphere not as explosive anger or open confrontation, but something far more unsettling: stunned silence. For decades, assumptions had quietly shaped expectations within the royal family. Philip's immense personal legacy, the networks he had built, the institutions he had nurtured, and the private influence he carried were widely believed to align naturally with the future of the monarchy itself. It seemed logical, almost inevitable, that such influence would ultimately reinforce the authority of the crown through the reigning monarch and the next generation of heirs. Yet the amendment had disrupted that quiet certainty in an instant. Philip had made a decision that bypassed those expectations entirely. What complicated the situation even further was the nature of the amendment itself. The document did not interfere with the monarchy's formal line of succession. Charles remained king, William remained the future heir. The constitutional order of the crown remained untouched. But Philip's private networks were never bound by constitutional law. They existed in a different realm, entirely a realm of personal trust, private partnerships, and carefully cultivated influence developed over decades. And within that realm, Philip had made Edward the sole guardian of everything he had built. Inside the palace, questions began circulating quickly, though rarely in public. Why Edward? Why not distribute these responsibilities among several members of the family? Why bypass individuals who stood closer to the crown's direct line of power? These were not accusations, but genuine confusion born from the weight of tradition. Royal structures had always relied on hierarchy, yet Philip's amendment seemed to follow a different logic altogether. Perhaps the most striking reaction came from Edward himself. Those familiar with the situation suggest that he had not expected the scale of responsibility described in the amendment. While Edward had worked closely with his father on various initiatives, particularly the Duke of Edinburgh Award Program, few believed he anticipated inheriting the entire infrastructure connected to Philip's legacy. What had once been collaborative involvement now transformed into something far heavier: stewardship over decades of influence, relationships, and strategic partnerships. Meanwhile, palace advisors began discussing the broader consequences of Philip's decision. Many of the initiatives connected to his legacy were not merely charitable projects, but long-term programs tied to youth development, international cooperation, and institutional alliances across multiple countries. Edward's new role meant that he would now guide the direction of these initiatives for years to come. The balance of internal influence within the royal ecosystem had shifted in a subtle but unmistakable way. Legal advisors reviewing the amendment left little room for debate. The document was meticulously prepared, properly authenticated, and structured with legal precision. Philip had anticipated scrutiny and ensured that every detail was secured beyond challenge. In other words, the monarchy could not reinterpret his wishes or quietly adjust the outcome. The decision stood exactly as Philip intended. Slowly, a new reality began settling within palace circles. Edward, long regarded as the most understated member of the royal siblings, had suddenly become the custodian of Prince Philip's entire private legacy. Not through ambition, not through competition, but through a decision made by Philip himself in the final chapter of his life. Yet as palace historians continued reviewing Philip's final letters, they uncovered one last message, one that may explain why Edward was chosen above everyone else. Tucked between legal documents and personal correspondence, archivists discovered something unexpected: a handwritten letter attached to Philip's amendment. It wasn't addressed to lawyers or palace officials. Instead, it carried a simple instruction: for the family to understand my reasoning. And within its lines, Philip appeared to reveal the philosophy that guided his final decision. When the letter was first uncovered, those examining Philip's records reportedly paused longer than usual before reading further. Legal documents were expected. Estate amendments were understandable. But a personal explanation written in Philip's own hand was something entirely different. It suggested that the Duke of Edinburgh had anticipated the confusion, perhaps even the tension that his decision might provoke within the family he had spent a lifetime protecting. And rather than allow speculation to define his motives, Philip had left behind something rare within royal archives: his own voice. The tone of the letter was neither defensive nor apologetic. Instead, it carried the calm authority of a man who had spent decades observing the monarchy from the most intimate position possible. Philip had stood beside the crown through wars of public opinion, political storms, generational change, and family struggles that rarely reached the outside world in full detail. The letter revealed that he understood better than most how fragile the institution could become when stability gave way to uncertainty. Within the opening lines, Philip reportedly spoke about the responsibility of safeguarding the monarchy's long-term stability. Not the ceremonial image presented to the public, but the deeper framework that allowed the institution to endure across generations. He wrote about how influence did not always need to be visible to be effective. In fact, he suggested the opposite, that some of the most important work supporting the monarchy must happen quietly, away from the pressures and expectations that come with the crown itself. That philosophy appeared to shape every word that followed. Philip explained that leadership within the royal family did not exist only through titles or positions in the line of succession. There were other forms of stewardship roles that required discretion, patience, and the ability to preserve delicate networks without drawing attention to them. According to the letter, these responsibilities demanded a temperament that understood the purpose of the monarchy rather than the prestige attached to it. It was here that Philip began writing about Edward. He described his youngest son not through grand achievements or public recognition, but through qualities that had developed quietly over years of observation. Edward, Philip wrote, had demonstrated something rare within a family constantly surrounded by attention and expectation: the ability to serve without seeking authority. He had never pursued power within the institution. He had never attempted to reshape the monarchy to fit his own ambitions. Instead, he had shown a consistent willingness to support its structure exactly as it existed. Philip suggested that this restraint mattered more than most people realized. In an environment where public attention could easily distort priorities, Edward remained focused on responsibility rather than recognition. According to Philip's words, this was precisely the mindset required to oversee the private networks and institutional partnerships that had grown around his legacy. The letter also contained moments of reflection about the pressures faced by each of Philip's children. Though he did not criticize or compare them directly, he acknowledged that royal life placed extraordinary demands on every member of the family. Different paths had emerged, shaped by different circumstances, expectations, and challenges. But the responsibilities connected to Philip's personal legacy required something very specific: continuity without competition. In that context, the amendment no longer appeared as favoritism. Philip framed it instead as strategic guardianship, a decision not about who deserved the inheritance most, but about who could protect it best. By the time the letter reached its closing lines, Philip's reasoning had become unmistakably clear. He believed Edward possessed the patience, discretion, and sense of duty necessary to carry forward the quiet work that Philip himself had spent decades building. The amendment, therefore, was not merely a transfer of influence. It was the continuation of a carefully designed legacy. But as historians debated the meaning of Philip's words, another revelation emerged, one that could shape the monarchy's future in ways nobody expected. For years, Prince Edward operated quietly within the royal institution, rarely commanding headlines, rarely stirring controversy. Yet Philip's amendment suddenly places him at the center of something far more powerful than public attention. With control over Philip's networks and legacy projects, Edward may now hold a form of influence that rivals even the monarchy's most senior figures. The realization began slowly, almost cautiously, within palace circles. At first, many focused on the emotional weight of Philip's final decision, examining the family implications and the personal meaning behind the amendment. But as analysts, advisors, and historians studied the structure of Philip's legacy more carefully, another layer began revealing itself. The networks Philip had built were not isolated charities or symbolic projects. They were expansive systems of influence stretching across countries, institutions, and generations of young people who had grown under programs connected to his vision. At the center of that influence stood the Duke of Edinburgh Award, one of the most recognized youth development initiatives in the world. For decades, the program had reached millions of participants across continents, encouraging resilience, leadership, and personal growth. It had become one of Philip's most enduring contributions to society. A global network that connected schools, communities, and organizations under a shared mission. With the amendment now in effect, Edward's role within that system expanded dramatically. What had once been a collaborative responsibility shared between father and son was now firmly under Edward's stewardship. Yet the award program was only one piece of the larger structure Philip had assembled. Behind it existed a web of philanthropic initiatives, research partnerships, environmental programs, and institutional relationships that extended into dozens of countries. These connections had grown quietly over decades, guided by Philip's personal involvement and strategic thinking. Now, with the amendment confirmed, Edward inherited the responsibility of guiding that network forward. Within royal circles, observers began describing the shift in striking terms. Edward, the prince who had long operated away from the intense glare of royal headlines, was now emerging as Philip's true institutional successor. Not in the ceremonial sense that accompanied royal titles, but in something perhaps even more enduring: the stewardship of a legacy that influenced millions of lives beyond the palace gates. The internal balance of influence within the monarchy began adjusting almost immediately. The crown itself would always remain the central symbol of royal authority. But Philip's networks represented another kind of power entirely. They connected the monarchy to communities, global organizations, and initiatives that transcended traditional royal duties. With Edward guiding those connections, his position within the broader structure of the royal family quietly strengthened. What made this transition even more remarkable was Edward's long-standing reputation for discretion. Throughout his life, he had rarely sought the spotlight that often accompanied royal status. His work had been steady, measured, and largely free from the controversies that occasionally surrounded other members of the family. That calm, almost understated approach now appeared to be one of the very qualities Philip valued most. Managing Philip's legacy required more than public presence. It demanded diplomacy, patience, and the ability to maintain delicate relationships across institutions and countries without drawing unnecessary attention to the mechanisms behind them. Edward's quiet nature, once viewed by some as a sign of limited ambition, suddenly appeared to be a strategic advantage. Inside the palace, some insiders began suggesting that Philip had designed the arrangement with careful foresight. By placing his networks in the hands of someone who avoided public drama, Philip may have ensured that his legacy could operate with stability even during turbulent moments for the royal family. In this interpretation, Edward's role was not meant to rival the crown, but to reinforce its strengthening the monarchy's global influence quietly, from behind the scenes. The transformation was subtle, yet profound. The prince, who had often been overlooked in public narratives, was now entrusted with safeguarding one of the most extensive private legacies ever built within the modern monarchy. Through Edward, Philip's influence would continue reaching millions of people across generations, shaping programs and initiatives that extended far beyond royal ceremony. And yet, even as this new reality began settling within palace corridors, historians studying Philip's amendment found themselves wrestling with a deeper possibility. Because when examined closely, the document seemed to carry a message that extended beyond Edward himself. And yet one final question still lingers within the palace archives: was Philip's amendment simply about Edward, or was it a warning about the future of the monarchy itself? In the end, Prince Philip spent more than 70 years watching the monarchy evolve through crises, scandals, and sweeping social change. He understood better than most that the survival of the institution required more than titles and ceremonies. It required guardians. When his final amendment surfaced, it revealed a profound truth. Philip wasn't merely distributing inheritance. He was choosing a protector for everything he had built. For much of modern history, the strength of the monarchy has been measured through succession, through crowns passed from one generation to the next, through titles that signal continuity and authority. Yet Prince Philip had lived long enough to understand that the survival of the institution depended on something deeper than hierarchy alone. Titles could command respect, but legacy required stewardship. Influence needed caretakers. The networks he had spent decades building could not simply be divided and expected to survive the pressures of time. Philip's amendment, when viewed through this lens, begins to resemble something far more deliberate than a personal family decision. It was a strategic act shaped by a lifetime of experience within the monarchy's most intimate inner circle. For 70 years, he had witnessed the crown endure moments of triumph and periods of crisis. He had watched public opinion shift, political landscapes evolve, and the expectations placed upon the royal family grow more intense with every passing decade. Those experiences left him with a deep understanding of how fragile influence could become if it lacked careful guardianship. By entrusting his private legacy to Edward, Philip appeared to be sending a message about how legacies should be protected. Not through rank, not through visibility, but through dedication to the work itself. Edward's role within this story suddenly takes on new meaning. For years, he had been perceived as the quiet prince, the sibling who rarely drew attention compared with the towering presence of the future kings. But Philip's amendment redefines that narrative completely. It suggests that the very qualities that once kept Edward outside the spotlight, his discipline, his patience, his refusal to chase recognition, were exactly the traits Philip valued most. Through Edward, the systems Philip built could continue operating without becoming entangled in the immense pressures that surround the crown. The global charitable infrastructure connected to Philip's legacy youth programs, institutional partnerships, environmental initiatives, and international networks would remain active and stable, guided by someone who understood their purpose rather than their prestige. Historians studying the amendment have suggested that this separation may actually strengthen the monarchy itself. By placing stewardship of these networks outside the direct line of succession, Philip may have ensured that his legacy could endure even as the crown navigated the unpredictable tides of modern public life. In this sense, Edward's role becomes symbolic of a different kind of royal leadership. Not the commanding authority associated with kingship, but something quieter and perhaps more enduring. Leadership through continuity, through careful management of influence that operates beyond ceremonial duty, through the ability to maintain relationships and programs that connect the monarchy with communities across the world. The ripple effects of Philip's decision may continue unfolding for years. Within palace corridors, the amendment forces a reconsideration of how influence truly functions inside the royal institution. Power is not always measured by the crown alone. Sometimes it rests in the networks, the partnerships, and the legacies that shape the monarchy's relationship with the world beyond its gates. For Edward, the transformation is remarkable. The prince, who once appeared to stand quietly on the edges of royal attention, now carries the responsibility of protecting everything Philip spent a lifetime building. What once seemed like a supporting role has evolved into one of the most consequential positions connected to Philip's enduring mission. And when the story is viewed from this wider perspective, the amendment begins to reveal what may have been Philip's final strategy. Not merely preserving his legacy, but ensuring that the monarchy itself would remain supported by a foundation strong enough to endure whatever challenges the future might bring. Because when historians close the final archive file on Philip's amendment, one conclusion becomes impossible to ignore: the quietest royal may now hold the most powerful legacy of all. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.